We're not saying we have the right, Blake said, trying to sound reasonable. We're just saying that as the landlord, you should consider what's best for the property's value. Having elderly tenants who can barely function isn't exactly attractive to potential renters, Nicole added. Plus, we've been patient. We tried to handle it ourselves, but they're so sensitive. The old man actually confronted us in the garden last week. He was aggressive, threatening. We felt unsafe. Daniel's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Threatened, really? A 72-year-old man with a cane made you feel unsafe? He was yelling, Trevor insisted. All because I was recording in a public space, which is my right. He demanded I delete my phone. That's harassment. You were recording what exactly? Trevor hesitated for just a second. Just, the garden. The building. General stuff. You were recording his wife while mocking her for gardening, Daniel said flatly. I've seen the footage from multiple witnesses. Would you like me to play it? The room went quiet. Ashley shifted in her seat. Blake's confident expression faltered slightly. Look, Blake tried again, his tone changing, becoming more conciliatory. Maybe we've all gotten off on the wrong foot. We're willing to let bygones be bygones. But moving forward, we really think it would be best if the elderly couple moved to somewhere more suitable for their needs. We're not heartless, we understand they need help. But this building isn't the right place for them. Daniel walked around the desk and sat on the edge of it, looking down at the four of them. Let me tell you about the elderly couple in Unit 4B. They've lived here for 3 years. In that time, they've never been late on rent. Not once. They've never caused property damage. They've maintained a community garden that benefits the entire building. They've been kind to every single neighbor, including offering you water on your move-in day, which you barely acknowledged. He paused, letting that sink in. In contrast, you four have been here for 2 months. In that time, I've received 17 noise complaints about your unit. You've violated quiet hours 43 times. You've left trash in hallways, propped open security doors, taken parking spots that weren't assigned to you, and created a hostile environment for multiple residents, not just the couple in 4B. Ashley opened her mouth to protest, but Daniel continued. Mrs. Patterson in 2A has complained about your behavior. Kevin in 3C has complained. Mr. Chen in 1A, who never complains about anything, sent an email last week saying he's considering moving because of you. You've managed to alienate an entire building in 8 weeks. Okay? So we've been a little loud, Trevor said defensively. That doesn't mean I'm not finished. Daniel's voice was still calm, but there was steel in it now. You've also been documenting your harassment. Trevor, the video you took in the garden. You posted it on social media with mocking captions. Ashley, you sent photos of Helen struggling with groceries to your group chat. We recovered those from the building's Wi-Fi network. Nicole, you've made ageist comments in the lobby that were overheard and reported by multiple witnesses. The four of them were no longer looking confident. Blake's face had gone pale. Ashley had put her phone down. Nicole had stopped filing her nails. We didn't mean anything by it, Nicole said weakly. It was just jokes between friends. Jokes, Daniel repeated. You think harassment is a joke? You think mocking someone for being old, for walking slowly, for needing a cane, for caring about a garden think that's funny? We didn't know they were that sensitive, Ashley tried. Daniel stood up, his composure finally cracking just slightly. They weren't being sensitive. They were being harassed. There's a difference. And here's what you didn't know. What you couldn't be bothered to know, because you were too busy being cruel. He picked up 4 envelopes from the desk. The elderly couple you've been demanding I evict? The ones you've been mocking and harassing for 2 months? The ones you think are too old and useless to live in your building? The 4 tenants stared at him, realization starting to dawn on their faces. Those are my parents. The silence in the room was absolute. Ashley's face went white. Blake's mouth fell open. Trevor looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. Nicole's eyes went wide with shock. Robert and Helen Wong are my parents, Daniel continued, his voice quiet now, but filled with controlled anger. They chose to live in this building, the building my grandmother owned for 40 years. The building I inherited, the building where they wanted to spend their retirement in peace because it's their home. They pay full rent, just like everyone else. They've never asked for special treatment. They just wanted to live quietly and tend their garden. He held out the envelopes. These are 30-day eviction notices. You're being evicted for material breach of lease harassment of other tenants, repeated noise violations, and creating a hostile housing environment. You have 30 days to vacate the premises. Trevor found his voice first. You can't do this. We have a lease. We have rights. We'll sue. Daniel handed the envelopes to Linda, who stood and gave one to each tenant. You absolutely have rights, and you're welcome to consult with an attorney. But I've consulted with mine, and given the documented evidence of harassment, repeated lease violations, and the hostile environment you've created, this eviction will hold up in any court. In fact, my attorney suggested we could pursue charges for elder harassment, but I'm choosing not to for now. Blake stood up, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. This is because they're your parents. You're abusing your power as landlord. No, Daniel said firmly. If they were anyone's parents, anyone's grandparents, any elderly couple at all, this would still be unacceptable. The fact that they're my parents just means I have all the information firsthand. But every word of your behavior has been documented and witnessed by multiple residents. Ashley was crying now, her confidence completely shattered. We didn't know. If you'd known they were my parents, you would have treated them differently. Daniel interrupted. That's the problem. You should have treated them with respect because they're human beings. Their relationship to me shouldn't matter. The 4 tenants left the office in stunned silence, clutching their eviction notices. Linda watched them go, then turned to Daniel. That was a long time coming, she said quietly. Your parents are good people. They didn't deserve any of this. Daniel nodded, but he didn't feel triumphant. He felt tired and sad that it had come to this at all. He spent the rest of the day in the building, talking to other tenants, reviewing maintenance requests, doing the things his grandmother used to do, treating the place like a community, not just a business. That evening, he had dinner with his parents in their apartment. Helen had made pot roast, Robert's favorite. They ate quietly at first, until Helen finally spoke. You didn't have to do that for us, she said softly. Evict them, I mean. Daniel set down his fork. Mom, I didn't do it just for you. I did it because they violated their lease repeatedly. They created a hostile environment for multiple residents. Any landlord would have done the same thing. But we're not just any residents, Robert said. We're your parents. People might think you're playing favorites. Let them think what they want. The documentation speaks for itself. Daniel reached across the table and took his mother's hand. Grandma built this place on the idea that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity. Those 4 forgot that. Or maybe they never learned it in the first place. Helen squeezed his hand, her eyes glistening with tears. I just hate that we caused so much trouble. We didn't cause anything. They did. Daniel looked at both his parents, these people who'd worked so hard their entire lives, who'd raised him to be kind and respectful, who'd never asked for anything they hadn't earned. You have every right to live here in peace. That's not asking too much. Over the next 30 days, the atmosphere in the building changed dramatically. The 4 tenants kept to themselves, coming and going quietly as they searched for new apartments. The constant parties stopped. The loud music ended. The hallways were peaceful again, but finding a new place wasn't easy for them. Word had spread through the local property management network. Linda had connections throughout the city. She'd been honest in her references when other landlords called. Blake found out that 3 places he'd applied to had rejected him based on his rental history. Ashley's application was denied at a luxury complex she'd been excited about. Trevor and Nicole had to settle for a place. It's much smaller and more expensive than they'd wanted. They tried to apologize in the second week. Blake knocked on Robert and Helen's door one evening, looking uncomfortable and embarrassed. Helen answered, and Blake stammered through an apology that sounded more worried about consequences than genuinely sorry. I just want you to know we didn't mean for things to get so out of hand, he said. We were just having fun. We didn't realize how it was affecting you. Helen looked at him for a long moment. She could have slammed the door. She could have told him exactly what she thought of his fun. But that wasn't who she was. Blake, she said gently, I'm 70 years old. I've lived through a lot. And the one thing I've learned is that how you treat people when you think no one. Important is watching. That's who you really are. Daniel Wong had never imagined he'd become a landlord. The small apartment building in downtown Portland wasn't something he'd planned for, it just happened. His grandmother passed away 2 years ago and left him the property in her will. She'd owned it for nearly 40 years. Collecting rent from families who stayed for decades, watching their kids grow up, celebrating their milestones. She treated every tenant like extended family. At first, Daniel thought about selling it. He had a demanding job running a software company, and property management seemed like a headache he didn't need. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the memory of visiting his grandmother there as a kid, playing in the hallways, helping her deliver holiday cookies to every door. Maybe it was the current tenants who showed up at the funeral, crying as hard as his own family. Whatever the reason, he kept it. He hired Linda Martinez as the property manager. She'd worked for his grandmother for 15 years and knew every pipe, every tenant, every cork of the building. Linda was the kind of person who remembered birthdays, noticed when someone was struggling, and fixed problems before they became emergencies. With her running things day to day, Daniel could focus on his business while still honoring his grandmother's legacy. Among the tenants were Daniel's own parents, Robert and Helen Wong. They were 72 and 70 years old, and they'd moved into Unit 4B 3 years ago. Their old house had become too much to handle, too many stairs, too much yard work, too many rooms that echoed with emptiness after their kids moved out. Daniel had offered to buy them a condo somewhere nice, but they refused. They wanted to live in the building, to be part of the community his grandmother had created. Robert walked with a cane now. An old construction injury from his 30s had finally caught up with him, leaving his right knee stiff and painful on cold mornings. Helen had arthritis in her hands, which made simple tasks like opening jars or carrying groceries more difficult than they used to be. But they were happy. They kept their apartment spotless, with photos of grandchildren covering the walls and the smell of Helen's cooking drifting into the hallway. Most evenings, the couple had their routines. Every morning, Robert would shuffle down to get the mail while Helen made coffee. On Tuesdays, they'd take the bus to the senior center for lunch and cards with friends. Weekends meant tending to the small community garden behind the building, where Helen grew tomatoes, herbs, and flowers that she shared with neighbors. They were quiet, respectful, beloved by everyone in the building. The other tenants looked out for them. Mrs. Patterson from Unit 2 would check in every few days. The college student in 3C always offered to carry Helen's groceries when he saw her coming home from the store. It was the kind of community Daniel's grandmother had built. It's people who actually cared about each other. Then Unit 5A became available. It was the largest apartment in the building, a corner unit with big windows and plenty of space. Linda listed it online, and within days she had applications flooding in. One group stood out for young professionals all in their late 20s, with solid jobs and excellent credit scores. They worked in marketing and finance for tech companies downtown. On paper, they were perfect tenants. Their names were Blake, Ashley, Trevor, and Nicole. They showed up to view the apartment in expensive clothes, carrying designer coffee cups, talking loudly on their phones about client meetings and quarterly reports. They loved the exposed brick and hardwood floors. Ashley gushed about how the space would be perfect for entertaining. Trevor mentioned they were only looking for a year lease, just until they could afford to buy something in the Pearl District. Linda had a strange feeling about them, something she couldn't quite name. But their application was flawless. They offered to pay 3 months up front. They had reference letters from previous landlords, though Linda noticed these were all corporate. Property management companies, not individual owners. She approved them anyway. Daniel signed off on it remotely, trusting her judgment. The four moved in on a Saturday in early September. They arrived with a moving truck full of expensive furniture, massive sectional sofa, a huge flat-screen television, a sound system with speakers that looked like they belonged in a nightclub. Other tenants watched curiously as the movers hauled everything up the stairs. Robert even offered them bottles of cold water, which they accepted without much acknowledgement. That first weekend, everything seemed fine. But by the following Friday night, the problems started. Music began blaring from Unit 5A around 9 in the evening. By 11, it was so loud that the bass was making picture frames rattle in the apartments below. By midnight, there were voices, laughing, people coming and going. The party didn't stop until nearly 3 in the morning. Mrs. Patterson called Linda at 7 the next morning, exhausted and frustrated. She hadn't slept all night. The college student sent a text message. Even Robert and Helen, who usually avoided complaining about anything, looked tired when Linda stopped by to check on them. Helen mentioned that she'd had a doctor's appointment that morning and had barely slept. But she said it so gently, so reluctantly. As if she felt guilty for even bringing it up, Linda went upstairs and knocked on the door of Unit 5A. Blake answered, looking hungover, squinting at the morning light. Linda politely but firmly explained the building's quiet hours, no excessive noise after 10 on weeknights, midnight on weekends. Blake mumbled an apology and closed the door. Linda heard laughter inside as she walked away. The next week, it happened again. Wednesday night, music until 2 in the morning. Linda sent an official written warning via email and slipped a copy under their door. She documented everything and sent reports to Daniel, who was traveling for business in Seattle. But it wasn't just the noise. Small things started happening that created tension throughout the building. The 4 new tenants would leave trash in the hallways. They'd prop open the main security door when they had guests, leaving the building vulnerable. They'd take up multiple parking spots with their cars, spreading out instead of parking efficiently. Then Robert and Helen started noticing something more personal. When they'd pass the new tenants in the hallway, there would be whispers and barely suppressed giggles. Ashley would look Helen up and down with an expression that wasn't quite friendly. Trevor would sigh loudly if he got stuck behind Robert on the stairs, as if the older man's careful. Slow descent was some kind of personal inconvenience. One evening, Helen was struggling to carry grocery bags from her car. She'd bought supplies to make soup for Mrs. Patterson, who'd been feeling under the weather. The bags were heavy, and her arthritic hands were aching. She stopped halfway across the parking lot to rest and adjust her grip. Nicole walked past with her gym bag, talking on her phone. Helen heard her say, clearly and loudly enough to be intentional, "Yeah, I'm telling you, this building is getting so old. I mean, literally the people, the whole vibe. I don't know why they don't just turn it into luxury condos already." Helen felt her face flush with embarrassment. She pretended not to hear, picking up her bags and continuing slowly toward the entrance. Robert, who'd been waiting by the door, had heard everything. The look on his face was one Helen hadn't seen in years, hurt mixed with anger. The expression of a man who'd worked hard his whole life and didn't deserve to be treated, like he was invisible or worthless. That night, as they unpacked groceries together in their small kitchen, neither of them mentioned what had happened, but something had shifted. The building that had felt like a safe, welcoming community was starting to feel different. And this was only the beginning. The harassment didn't stop with whispered comments and rude stares. If anything, it got worse. Robert and Helen tried their best to ignore it, the way they'd learned to ignore a lot of things over 7 decades of life. But ignoring something doesn't make it hurt any less. It was a Wednesday evening when things escalated. Robert and Helen had just finished dinner, grilled chicken and vegetables. The kind of simple meal they'd eaten together thousands of times. They were washing dishes when the music started upstairs. Not just loud, but overwhelming. The kind of bass that makes your chest vibrate and your ears ring. Helen glanced at the clock. It was barely 8:30. She looked at Robert with tired eyes. "Maybe it'll stop soon," she said. Hopefully it didn't. By 10 o'clock, the noise had only gotten louder. By 11, Helen had given up trying to watch television. The sound from above drowned out everything. Robert sat in his recliner, gripping the armrests, his jaw tight with frustration. At midnight, when the thumping bass was joined by shouting and laughter, he'd had enough. "I'm going up there," he said, pushing himself out of the chair with his cane. "Robert, please." "Let's just call Linda in the morning," Helen pleaded. She knew her husband. He was a proud man, a former construction foreman who'd spent his career managing crews and solving problems. But he was also 72 years old, with a bad knee, and she worried about confrontation. "It is morning, Helen. It's past midnight. Some of us have to get up early." Robert's voice was firm but not angry. He'd always been good at staying calm, even when he was upset. "I'll be polite. I'll just ask them to turn it down." Helen followed him to the door, watching as he made his way slowly down the hall and up the stairs to the 5th floor. Each step was careful, deliberate. His knee always hurt more at night. She waited at their door, arms crossed, listening to the muffled sounds of the party above. Robert reached Unit 5A and knocked firmly on the door. He had to knock 3 times before anyone heard him over the music. When the door finally opened, it was Blake who answered. His eyes were glassy, his shirt unbuttoned, a drink in his hand. The smell of alcohol wafted out into the hallway. "Yeah," Blake said, not quite focusing on Robert's face. "I'm sorry to bother you," Robert began, his voice steady and respectful, "but it's after midnight on a weeknight. The music is very loud. My wife and I have been trying to sleep. Could you please turn it down?" Blake stared at him for a moment, then glanced back into the apartment where the others were laughing about something. He turned back to Robert and gave a lazy nod. "Whatever." The door closed before Robert could say thank you. He stood there for a moment, then made his way back downstairs. When he reached their apartment, Helen was waiting. What did they say? He said he'd turn it down. They waited. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes, the music didn't get quieter. If anything, it seemed louder, as if they'd turned it up out of spite. Helen saw Robert's hands curl into fists, but he said nothing. They went to bed, lying awake in the darkness, feeling every beat of the bass through their ceiling. The next morning, both of them were exhausted. Helen had a headache that wouldn't go away. Robert moved even slower than usual, his whole body stiff from tension and lack of sleep. As they left for their Thursday errands, they ran into the 4 tenants in the lobby. The young people were heading out, dressed for work, laughing about something on someone's phone. When Ashley saw Robert and Helen, she didn't even try to hide her smirk. She elbowed Nicole and whispered something. Nicole glanced over and snickered. Trevor held the door open for them, but the gesture felt mocking rather than polite, the way he made a big show of it with an exaggerated bow. "After you, sir," Trevor said, drawing out the word sir in a way that made it sound like an insult. Robert nodded stiffly and walked past, Helen close behind him. They heard the laughter start up again as soon as they were outside. Helen reached for Robert's hand and squeezed it. Neither of them spoke about it. Over the next 2 weeks, the pattern continued and worsened. Loud music on weeknights, parties that ran until 3 or 4 in the morning. Linda sent more warnings. She slipped notices under their door. Nothing changed. But the real problem wasn't just the noise anymore. It was the way. The 4 tenants had started treating Robert and Helen like they were invisible. Or worse, like they were obstacles that shouldn't exist. Robert's assigned parking spot number for B, right near the building entrance, started being taken. At first it happened once, and Robert just parked farther away and limped to the door. Then it happened again and again. By the 3rd week, it was happening almost daily. Blake's black SUV would be sitting in Robert's spot, forcing the elderly man to park at the far end of the lot and walk an extra 100 feet on his bad knee. Helen noticed it one evening, as she came home from the grocery store. Robert was walking from the far corner of the parking lot, moving slowly, his face tight with pain. She felt something break inside her chest. "That's your spot," she said, pointing to where Blake's vehicle sat. "You should say something." "I did. I left a note on his windshield yesterday." He just threw it on the ground. The disrespect was constant now. When Robert would be walking down the hallway with his cane, Trevor would come up behind him and sigh dramatically, loud enough for everyone to hear. Once he actually said, "Come on, buddy. Some of us have places to be," as if Robert was moving slowly just to inconvenience him. In the laundry room one afternoon, Helen was folding clothes when Ashley and Nicole came in. They were talking about their weekend plans, something about a wine-tasting tour. When they noticed Helen, they didn't stop their conversation, but Ashley's voice got louder, more pointed. "I just think it's weird that people that old still try to do everything themselves," Ashley said, not looking at Helen, but clearly talking about her. "Like at some point, you have to accept you need help, or that maybe you shouldn't be living independently anymore." Nicole nodded. Totally. My grandmother went into assisted living at like 70. It's just safer. Plus, then buildings like this could be for people who actually have lives and social circles. Helen's hands trembled as she folded a towel. She wanted to say something, to defend herself, to point out that she was perfectly capable of living independently. That she and Robert had raised 3 children, owned a home, worked hard their entire lives. That being 70 didn't make them useless or invisible, but the words stuck in her throat. She finished her laundry in silence and left, while they were still laughing about something on their phones. That night, she cried for the first time in months. Not loud, desperate crying, but quiet tears that ran down her cheeks as she sat on the edge of the bed. Robert found her there and sat down beside her, putting his arm around her shoulders. "We could move," he said quietly. "Daniel would help us find another place." "That's our home," Helen said, her voice small and broken. "We shouldn't have to leave because some kids decided we don't belong here." Robert pulled her closer. He didn't have an answer for that, because she was right. They'd done nothing wrong. They paid their rent. They followed the rules. They were kind to their neighbors. And yet here they were, being made to feel like they were the problem. The final straw came on a Saturday afternoon. Helen had been working in the community garden, something she'd done every weekend for 3 years. She'd planted tomatoes, basil, and marigolds. Other tenants would stop by to chat, to admire the flowers, to take herbs she offered freely. It was her favorite part of living in the building. She was on her knees, pulling weeds, when she heard voices. The 4 tenants had come outside, returning from brunch somewhere. They were drunk, stumbling a little, laughing too loudly. Stopped near the garden, and Helen looked up, hoping they'd just walk past. Instead, Ashley pointed at her. "Look, Grandma's playing in the dirt." The others laughed. Trevor pulled out his phone and started recording. "This is so sad," he said to the camera. "Old people with nothing better to do than garden. Like, get a life." Helen felt her face burn with humiliation. She tried to stand up, but her arthritic knees made it difficult. She struggled for a moment, and the 4 of them just watched, still laughing, still recording. Then Robert appeared. He'd been taking out the trash and saw what was happening. He walked toward them, his cane hitting the pavement with each step, his face darker than Helen had seen it in years. "Delete that video," Robert said, his voice low and controlled. "Right now?" Trevor looked at him, still holding up his phone. "Or what, old man? You gonna make me?" The confrontation in the garden drew attention. Mrs. Patterson had been watching from her window and came rushing outside. The college student from 3C was coming back from his morning run and stopped when he saw what was happening. Even Mr. Chen from Unit 1A, a quiet man who usually kept to himself, stepped out onto his balcony to see what the commotion was about. Robert stood his ground, facing Trevor, who still held his phone up, smirking. The other 3 tenants had stopped laughing, but they hadn't moved to help. They just stood there, watching like it was entertainment. "I said delete it," Robert repeated, his voice shaking, now not with fear, but with barely contained anger. "You have no right to record my wife and mock her." "Gosh." Trevor lowered his phone slightly, but the smirk didn't fade. "It's a free country, old-timer. I can record whatever I want in a public space. Maybe if you guys can't handle people having fun, you should move to a retirement home where you belong." That's when Helen found her voice. She'd managed to stand up, dirt on her knees, her gardening gloves still on her hands. "We have every right to be here," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "This is our home. We pay our rent just like you do." Ashley rolled her eyes dramatically. "Barely, I'm sure. You're probably on some fixed income, paying like half what we pay." "That's none of your business," Robert said sharply. Blake, who'd been quiet until now, stepped forward. He wasn't as drunk as the others. Something in his expression had shifted. Maybe he realized they'd crossed a line. Or maybe he just wanted to avoid a scene. "Look, let's all just calm down. We were just joking around." "Joking?" Mrs. Patterson had reached the garden now, her voice cutting through the tension. "I've been watching you harass this couple for weeks. There's nothing funny about it. You should be ashamed of yourselves." Nicole turned to her with a dismissive wave. "Oh, come on, we're not harassing anyone. They're just overly sensitive." "Maybe because they're..." She tapped her temple, implying they were senile. That's when the college student spoke up. His name was Kevin, and he'd lived in the building for 2 years while finishing his degree. You guys are way out of line. Robert and Helen have been nothing but nice since I moved here. You've been nothing but a nightmare since day one. The 4 tenants looked around, suddenly aware that they weren't getting the support they expected. Other residents had gathered, some on balconies, some at windows, a few more coming outside. The community that Daniel's grandmother had built was showing itself. Trevor finally pocketed his phone. Whatever. You people are ridiculous. Come on, let's go. We started walking toward the building, and the others followed, but not before Ashley shot one more comment over her shoulder. This building is full of people who can't mind their own business. No wonder the rent is so cheap. When they were gone, Mrs. Patterson helped Helen brush the dirt off her clothes. Kevin offered Robert a bottle of water. Mr. Chen came down from his balcony to check if they were all right. For a few minutes, the small group stood together, making sure Robert and Helen were okay. You should tell Daniel, Mrs. Patterson said firmly. This has gone too far. Linda already knows, Robert said, his anger deflating into exhaustion. She's been documenting everything, but I don't know what good it does. They don't listen to her. They recorded you, Kevin pointed out. That's harassment. That's evidence. Helen was quiet, staring at her tomato plants. One of them had been stepped on during the confrontation, the stem broken, the small green tomatoes scattered on the ground. It was such a small thing, but it felt enormous. She'd planted that seed in spring, watered it every day, watched it grow. And now it was ruined because someone thought it was funny to mock an old woman for caring about something. That evening, Linda came to their apartment. She brought copies of all the complaints, all the warnings she'd sent, all the documentation of lease violations. She also brought something else, a compilation of security camera footage from the hallways and parking lot. The cameras didn't cover everywhere, but they'd caught enough. Blake's car in Robert's spot multiple times, Trevor following too close behind Robert in the hallway, sighing dramatically. The 4 of them laughing and pointing as Robert struggled with his groceries. I've sent all of this to Daniel, Linda said, sitting at their small kitchen table. He's flying back tomorrow. He wants to handle this personally. Robert and Helen exchanged glances. They'd never wanted to be a burden to their son. They'd never wanted him to have to deal with problem tenants because of them. We don't want to cause trouble, Helen said softly. Linda reached across the table and took Helen's hand. You're not causing trouble. They are. And this stops now. That night, Robert couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Trevor's words, move to a retirement home where you belong, as if being older meant you didn't deserve to live in a regular apartment, to have a garden, to be part of a community. He'd worked construction for 40 years, built homes and buildings all over the city. He'd raised 3 kids, paid his taxes, been a good neighbor. And now, some kids barely out of college were treating him like he was worthless because he walked with a cane and had gray hair. Beside him, Helen was awake too. He could tell by her breathing. You okay? He whispered. I keep thinking about when we were their age, she said quietly. We would never have treated elderly people that way. Our parents taught us better. What happened to respect? Robert didn't have an answer. The world had changed in ways he didn't always understand. But he knew one thing: respect shouldn't change. Kindness shouldn't change. Treating people with dignity shouldn't depend on how old they are or how fast they can walk. The next day was Sunday. Daniel arrived in the early afternoon, letting himself into the building with his key. He went straight to his parents' apartment. When Helen opened the door and saw her son standing there, she started crying. She'd been holding it together for weeks. But seeing him made all the emotions spill out. Daniel hugged his mother, looking over her shoulder at his father, who sat in his recliner, looking older and more tired than Daniel had ever seen him. His dad had always been strong, unshakable, but now he just looked worn down. Tell me everything, Daniel said, sitting down with them. They told him. Not just the facts that Linda had reported, but how it felt. Helen described the humiliation of being mocked in the garden. Robert talked about the frustration of having his parking spot taken, of being treated like an obstacle in his own home. They told him about the sleepless nights, the constant anxiety, the way they'd started dreading leaving their apartment because they might run into the 4 tenants. Daniel listened, his jaw getting tighter with every word. When they finished, he sat back and let out a long breath. "I'm so sorry," he said. "I should have come back sooner. I should have dealt with this weeks ago." "You have a business to run," Robert said. "We didn't want to bother you. You're my parents." "You're never a bother." Daniel pulled out his phone and started making calls. First to Linda, then to his lawyer. He asked for copies of the lease agreement, the complaint documentation, the security footage. He asked about eviction procedures and tenant rights. When he finished his calls, he looked at his parents. "I'm meeting with them tomorrow. All four of them. They're going to learn something they should have learned a long time ago." "What's that?" Helen asked. "That actions have consequences, and that the people they've been treating like garbage." He paused, his voice catching slightly. "Those are the people who actually own the building they're living in." Robert's eyes widened. "Daniel, you don't have to tell them." "Oh, I'm telling them. They've been demanding you be evicted. Did you know that?" Linda showed me the emails. "They actually wrote to me, to the landlord, demanding that the elderly couple in 4B be removed from the building because you're lowering the quality of the place." Helen's hand went to her mouth. "They didn't." "They did." "Well, tomorrow they're going to find out exactly who they've been harassing. And then they're going to find out what it feels like to be the ones who have to leave." That night, for the first time in weeks, Robert and Helen slept peacefully. Their son was home. Someone was finally standing up for them. And tomorrow, the four people who'd made their lives miserable were going to learn that bullying has consequences. Monday. Morning came with clear skies and cool air. Daniel had scheduled the meeting for 10 o'clock in the small property management office on the first floor of the building. He'd sent formal emails to all four tenants the night before, requesting their presence for an important discussion regarding their tenancy. The email was professional, almost cold in its tone, signed simply as building owner. Ashley, Trevor, and Nicole arrived together, dressed in their work clothes, clearly annoyed at having to take time off. They walked into the small office where Linda sat behind the desk, and Daniel stood by the window, his back to them, looking out at the parking lot. "This better be quick," Trevor said, checking his watch. "Some of us have actual jobs to get to." Daniel turned around slowly. He was wearing a dark suit, his expression neutral, giving nothing away. He gestured to the four chairs arranged in front of the desk. "Please, sit down." Exchanging glances with each other. Ashley was scrolling through her phone. Blake looked bored. Nicole was filing her nails. Trevor kept sighing, making it clear he thought this was a waste of his time. "Thank you for coming," Daniel began, his voice calm and measured. "I'm Daniel Wong. I own this building." That got their attention. Ashley looked up from her phone. Blake sat up a little straighter. But they still didn't look worried, just mildly more interested than before. "We know who you are," Blake said with a slight shrug. "We sent you emails. About the issues we've been having with certain tenants?" "Ah, yes, the emails." Daniel picked up a folder from the desk. "Let me read a few excerpts. The elderly couple in Unit 4B is constantly complaining about normal living sounds." That was from you, Blake, and this one from Ashley. "These old people can't handle city living. Should be relocated to an appropriate facility." Trevor, "You wrote that I should upgrade the tenant quality by removing residents who don't fit the building's image." He set the folder down and looked at each of them in turn. "And Nicole, you sent the most recent one just last week, suggesting that I evict the couple in 4B because they're," and I quote, "clearly too old to live independently and are bringing down the property value." The four of them didn't look ashamed. If anything, they looked validated, like Daniel was finally seeing their point of view. "So you did get our emails," Ashley said, leaning forward. "Look, we're not trying to be mean, but it's true. They complain about everything. They can't handle normal noise levels. And honestly, this building could attract a much better class of tenant if Daniel held up his hand, cutting her off. Let me make sure I understand. You want me to evict the elderly couple in Unit 4B because they've complained about your behavior?" "It's not just complaints," Trevor jumped in. "They're just not a good fit for the building. They're slow, they take up parking spaces, they're always in the way. We're young professionals paying good money to live here. We deserve to have neighbors who actually contribute something. Linda was taking notes, her face carefully neutral, but Daniel could see her jaw tightening. He nodded slowly, as if considering their words. I see. And you believe that your rent payment gives you the right to determine who else gets to live here? You didn't treat us badly because you didn't know we were Daniel's parents. You treated us badly because you thought you could. Because you thought we didn't matter? Blake's face flushed red. He opened his mouth, closed it, then finally nodded. You're right. I'm sorry, truly. He walked away, and Helen never saw him try to apologize again. The others didn't even try. Ashley avoided eye contact whenever they passed in the hallway. Trevor and Nicole left the building through the back entrance to avoid running into anyone. They moved out 3 days before their notice was up, leaving the apartment cleaner than it had been when they moved in, probably hoping it might help their chances of getting their deposit back. The day after they left, something wonderful happened. A young couple came to look at Unit 5A. They had a baby girl, maybe 6 months old, with curious eyes and a gummy smile. Their names were David and Lisa Chen-No, relation to the Wongs, despite the shared last name. They were teachers, both of them. Looking for a place close to the schools where they worked, Linda showed them the apartment. And afterward, they met some of the other residents in the lobby. When they saw Robert and Helen coming in from the garden, Lisa's face lit up. Oh, I love that there's a garden, she said enthusiastically. We want to teach our daughter about growing food. Do you think we could help out? Helen's whole face transformed. Of course, we'd love to have you. I can show you how to plant vegetables, and we have flowers that attract butterflies' children. Love that. Robert offered to help them move their furniture when they were ready. Mrs. Patterson brought over a baby blanket she'd knitted. Kevin offered to babysit when they needed help. Within an hour, David and Lisa had been welcomed into the community in a way that Blake, Ashley, Trevor, and Nicole never had been, because they approached it with kindness and respect. The young family moved in 2 weeks later. On their first Saturday, they came down to the garden where Helen was working. Lisa carried the baby in a sling while David pushed a small stroller loaded with gardening tools. They spent the morning planting tomatoes together, with Helen showing them how to stake the plants and pinch off the suckers. The baby reached out tiny hands toward the leaves, giggling when they brushed against her fingers. Robert sat on a bench nearby watching. Daniel had come by to help with the move and stayed for the garden session. He sat down next to his father, and for a while, they just watched in comfortable silence. This is what Grandma wanted, Robert said finally. People taking care of each other. Yeah, Daniel agreed. It is. Those 4 kids, Robert continued. They're going to remember this for the rest of their lives. What they did? The consequences. Maybe it'll make them think twice before they treat someone that way again. Daniel nodded. Maybe. But even if it doesn't, at least they learned that actions have consequences. That you can't just treat people like they're disposable and expect nothing to happen. Robert turned to look at his son. Thank you. For standing up for us. For believing us. Of course I believe you. But more than that, you're good people who deserved better. That's what mattered. In the garden, Helen was laughing as the baby grabbed a tomato leaf. Lisa was taking a photo. David was asking questions about composting. Mrs. Patterson had come down with lemonade for everyone. Kevin arrived with his guitar, saying he'd been practicing a lullaby. It was exactly what a community should be. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Robert and Helen sat on their small balcony watching the sunset. The city spread out before them, lights starting to twinkle as darkness fell. Helen's tomato plants were visible just below, healthy and growing, including the new ones they'd planted with David and Lisa. We could have left, Helen said quietly. When it got bad, we could have asked Daniel to help us find somewhere else. But we didn't want to leave, Robert replied. This is our home. We shouldn't have to leave because someone decided we didn't belong. Helen reached over and took his hand. I'm glad we stayed. I'm glad we stood up for ourselves. Robert squeezed her hand. Me too. Below them, they could hear the sounds of the building normal sounds. A television playing softly. Someone cooking dinner. A baby crying briefly, then being soothed. No pounding music. No cruel laughter. just life. Being lived by people who'd learned to treat each other with basic human decency. The story of what happened spread beyond the building. Other tenants told friends. Linda mentioned it in her property management circles. It became a reminder that how you treat people matters, regardless of their age, their speed, their abilities. That respect isn't something you give only to people who can benefit you, it's something you give to everyone, simply because they're human. Blake, Ashley, Trevor. And Nicole moved on to other apartments, other lives. Maybe they learned something from the experience. Maybe they didn't. But in that small building in Portland, the community continued to thrive. New families moved in and were welcomed. The garden grew. Neighbors looked out for each other, and Robert and Helen Wong continued to live in Unit 4B, tending their tomatoes, sharing herbs with neighbors, improving that dignity, respect, kindness, never go out of style no matter how old you are. Sometimes the best victory isn't about revenge or punishment. It's about standing up for what's right. It's protecting the people who can't always protect themselves, and building the kind of community where everyone is valued. Daniel's grandmother had understood that. Daniel understood it. And now, hopefully, for young people somewhere in the city understood it too. The building his grandmother, built with love and care, continued to stand. Filled with people who understood that a home is more than just walls and rent payments. It's about respect, community, and the simple truth that every person deserves to be treated with dignity, whether they're 28 or 72, whether they walk with a cane or run marathons, whether they're the landlord's parents or complete strangers. That was the lesson. And it was one worth learning.